This is Join Us in France, episode 201. Bonjour, I'm Annie, and Join Us in France is the podcast where we talk about France, its many quirks, its history, its language, and of course, destinations in France you want to learn about because hopefully you'll be visiting soon. On today's episode, I talked to Phil Robertson about the history of Operation Overlord, or the liberation of Normandy. We discuss how the Allies prepared and how these events went down and led to the liberation of Paris and France. So if you're going to Normandy and you want a refresher about all the things related to D-Day that happened there, this is the episode for you. And when I want to scare myself just a little bit, I think how the 20th century and how my own life as a French person would have turned out so differently without what the Allies did to liberate France. I can never express how much I appreciate what these people did, and I know my fellow French citizens feel the same way. I had the privilege to see D-Day celebrations in Normandy in 2018, and it was outstanding. I won't go into it in this episode because it would make it too long, but I'll talk about it at length on some other occasion. When Phil and I recorded this episode, we somehow managed to overlook a really important part of Operation Overlord that happened in Arromanches-les-Bains. So that's where the artificial harbor was, also called Gold Beach. Phil realized it within a few hours and called the voicemail and left a really interesting explanation of what happened at Arromanches-les-Bains. So you'll hear that right after the end of the interview. If you're interested about the history of the Battle of Normandy, you should also check out episode 18S, D-Day History, Normandy Invasion Special. Elise and I published this episode at the beginning of our podcasting journey, but the information is still as true and relevant as ever. I will also play some feedback from Steve at the end of the episode, where he talks about how much he enjoyed the episode about food prices in French grocery stores. That was episode 197. I should have played that feedback several episodes ago, but as busy as I've been, it just fell through the cracks. You can also leave voice feedback by calling 1-801-806-1015. I'd love to get more voicemails, about maybe a restaurant you liked in Paris, or a hotel you loved, or some activity you found out about that you want to share with everyone. It doesn't have to be super long, but it'd be good to have your feedback in with your own voice. It is, after all, a podcast. Show notes and photos for this episode are on joinusinfrance.com/201. Join Us in France is brought to you by Patreon supporters and Addicted to France, the small group tour company for people who want to enjoy France to the fullest with zero stress. We have a sold-out tour coming up in September in the Dordogne, and Elise and I will get together as soon as we both, actually stop traveling and we can get together in the same room with a cup of coffee and decide on new dates and possibly new tours. I will keep you updated. Join Us in France needs your support. To see all the way you can support the show, visit joinusinfrance.com/support. Hello, Phil, and welcome to Join Us in France for your third time.
Bonjour, Annie. I feel very honored to be on the podcast again.
Bonjour. It's lovely to have you. We've been discussing doing an episode together about the Battle of Normandy, or
yes.
I guess Operation Overlord is another name for it. And I'm very excited to have you on because this is something I know a little bit about, but not enough to really conduct a full episode on it. And so it's lovely to have you. Could you introduce yourself a little bit and tell us why you're so interested in Normandy?
Sure. Well, first and foremost, I'm a huge fan of Join Us in France, so hence being on a couple times and listening to almost every episode. But I'm an amateur historian. I'm not a professional, but I've got a real interest in World War II in general, and particularly the Battle of Normandy. I've been over there 7 times, 5 of which were on the anniversary of D-Day.
That's a lot more than me, by the way.
Yeah, well, and I would go back this year if I could, but I'm certainly going to go back next year when it's the 75th anniversary.
I'm going this year. Ha ha, ha ha.
Ah, well, you'll have to send me pictures.
Yes.
I've got an interest in skydiving as well, and I think that's one thing that got me originally interested. I had a boss who was, when I was a very young kid, he was a paratrooper on D-Day, and his first combat ever was jumping into German-occupied France in Normandy.
Wow.
And I think that got me interested in both parachuting and in Normandy. And I went there once to kind of check it off my list and found that I fell in love with the whole area for a lot of reasons other than just the history of World War II. So I've been back a number of times, and I'll go back again, I'm sure.
Very cool. That's lovely. That's wonderful.
Yeah.
And you also, in your notes here, you talk about volunteering at a museum in Massachusetts?
Yes, there is a wonderful museum in Massachusetts that so many people don't know about, but it's one of the most amazing collections of artifacts from World War II in general, and certainly the Normandy area as well. It's called the International Museum of World War II, and I think their website is museumofwwii.com, and they're at capacity in their current building. So they're actually in fundraising to build a new building next door and kind of expand it. But it's a great museum, and I've volunteered their videoing lecture series, which is mostly veterans of World War II that will come in there, as well as some historians. And I go there whenever I can on my spare time.
Oh, very nice. Very nice. Yeah. Okay, so let's get into this, into D-Day and what happened specifically on that day.
Okay, well, let me first clarify that D-Day was June 6, 1944, and it's sometimes equated with the Battle of Normandy. But really, D-Day was just the first day of the Battle of Normandy.
Yeah.
And the Battle of Normandy is generally considered until they went entirely through the peninsula and liberated Paris in August 25th. So it was a 2.5, 3 month battle to take that whole area. But D-Day was, the first assault on German-occupied Europe. I shouldn't say that. There actually were some assaults in the south, in Italy. But this was the first major offensive.
Right. They had done Italy and North Africa first.
Correct.
Algeria, yeah. Yeah,
Algeria. And they'd done a lot of tank battles with some of the same people they met in Normandy in Africa. And it still is the largest amphibious attack in history. And it's hard to imagine that there would be a larger one today because a lot of it was based on secrecy and disguising just huge quantities of men and vehicles and naval craft and aircraft. And I can't imagine you'd keep that sort of thing secret these days with satellites and internet and things like that.
Yeah.
Because although the Germans expected the Allies to attack at some point and probably in Northern Europe. They weren't sure when, and they weren't sure where. So they had to kind of spread their defenses everywhere. And had they known when and where, they probably could have defeated it at the shore. And there was a very famous book called The Longest Day. And I believe that phrase came up from General Erwin Rommel, who was a German commander in charge of the defenses of Normandy. And he thought that the battle would be decisive at the shore. And
right, I remember that, yes.
And that day would be the most decisive, and for everyone involved, that would be, in his words, the longest day. So I think when we talk today about D-Day and the Battle of Normandy, I think what I'll probably do is just confine things to D-Day and the first week or two afterwards, which is when the Allied forces started pushing inland.
Very good.
So as a little bit of a historical context, World War II started in September of 1939 when Germany invaded Poland. And that's when pretty much all the Allies realized you couldn't make a deal with Germany. And I forget exactly what order, but England and then Canada and France declared war.
Yeah.
America didn't really get involved, although there was a big push to get involved. But there was a lot of resistance, too. And America didn't really get involved until the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor in December of 1941.
Yeah.
And then we declared war on Japan immediately. And then Hitler, which was kind of a strategical mistake on his part, declared war on the U.S. The U.S. had not declared war on Germany. And like I say, there was some resistance. There was a lot of Germanic people in the U.S. It was easily racially to look at the Japanese as a different people, etc.
Yeah.
But once Germany declared war on us, all bets were off.
Yeah. There's no way they could say we won't defend ourselves.
Exactly.
Right.
Exactly.
Right.
So by early 1944, Germany had occupied most of Western Europe. And they certainly occupied France, although their occupation of France was somewhat split between, complete occupation forces in the north of France and the Vichy government, which pretty much controlled, under the German rule, the south of France.
Right.
And Vichy France was considered, the collaborationist government.
Yes.
Although some would argue that they were just doing what they had to do to survive.
Well, that's one way to put it.
Doesn't everybody in war? Right?
Yeah.
So the major allies against Germany were the United States, England, and Russia. And there was a whole bunch of others as well, but those were certainly the largest countries. And England and Russia with a lot at stake because, England had the Battle of Britain. If Germany wasn't contained, they fully expected the Germans to invade over there. Mm-hmm. Russia was fighting Germany in the east and suffering huge losses. Well, both countries were suffering huge losses. It's hard to fathom the scale of death and destruction on the Eastern Front. And I won't pretend to know a lot about it other than to know it was huge.
Yeah, it was bad.
And like you said, the U.S. and England had battled Germany in North Africa and in southern Italy. But there was generally an acceptance among the three big allies and a push from Russia to open up another front. Basically, until Germany had to defend to their west, they could pour a lot of forces into the east against Russia. And Russia was very anxious for those forces to be
to be busy somewhere else.
Yeah. And many people would say that Hitler made a huge strategic error trying to battle everybody at once because in the end, he simply couldn't. Yeah. He had started with Russia as an ally and then attacked them. So, so that was kind of where the world and where Europe was, at least in early 1944. The U.S. had been building up forces in England in anticipation of a major offensive. I think there were about 1.5 million soldiers in England, just kind of poised and ready and waiting for the plans to develop for a major attack. Mm-hmm. France, as we mentioned, was under occupation, although there were some people that were out of France that were willing to fight with the Allies. But occupation meant, war meant rationing of everything because war is expensive. So you have to ration food, clothing, fuel, tires, petrol. I mean, you name it. It's
everything, yes. Supply. Yes, and it was rationed with, you would get coupons that would allow you to go buy a liter, a liter of oil or something.
Yeah, or a half pound of butter or some sugar. Everything you wanted to buy, you had to have one of these coupons for.
Yeah. And
it's easy to imagine, of course I wasn't alive back then, but it's easy to imagine that in places like England and the U.S., there was at least patriotism that, we're doing without so the boys on the front can have what they need to win the war. Mm-hmm. I'm imagining that in France it felt very differently. Because if you're doing without, it means you're giving more food and material to the people that are occupying and oppressing you.
It's true. That's who's taking it.
Yeah. So, and like everywhere in war, there's a huge black market and things.
Yeah.
Normandy, as far as food went, did a little better than the rest of France because Normandy is a huge food-producing region. Yeah. It's a dairy region, apple region. There's farms, there's vegetables. So it's easier to divert a little butter or, bushel of apples or something without anyone noticing than it would be in a city where you have major distribution networks and everything's, counted and measured and allocated.
Exactly, yeah.
So then, the Norman citizens did without a lot, and I won't say they were eating great, but they were eating better than their Parisian counterparts. And also, I think the occupation forces there were a little most of the French didn't want them there, but for a lot of the Germans, it was kind of a good place to be. There was no battle at that point.
Right. There was no, yeah.
They could have been on the Russian front. Instead, they're living in this nice farmland and eating fairly well.
That's
and of
a
course,
good point.
They would requisition whatever they need, including men to build their defenses, buildings. If there's a nice civilian home and a general is there and they need a headquarters, we're taking this home. So
yep.
That's part of the occupation which happens everywhere, but had to be particularly ugly there.
Yep.
So the Allies really needed to invade, and I use that term loosely, but had to attack German-occupied France. And the question was where? England was the staging grounds for most of the men and material, and that's where the U.S. kind of used its European base because it was really an island within Europe that wasn't invaded.
Right.
England themselves really pushed for something in the south of France and, going up through south of France or Italy. And I think that they were just war fatigued and had war at their doorstep. They had, German planes bombing their cities, and they really wanted to push things away from them rather than have it right on their doorstep.
Mm-hmm.
But northern France made a lot more sense logistically. You have to get all those people across the ocean, and across the ocean in the north of France means across the English Channel, which is relatively close. It's also, closer to the heart of Germany, and it's closer not just for the initial attack, but also to resupply the men and material you have on the ground.
True.
So if you look at a map between England and France, the logical place to attack or to get a lodgment in the continent would be the Pas de Calais, which was the closest point across English Channel to England.
Right.
It was a major port, which you need to have to resupply people. But so it was the logical place to attack. And because of this, it was logical to Germany as well. And they heavily defended that area. Mm-hmm. They heavily defended the whole coast. But, they looked at a place they expected us to attack. And that's where they put, the bulk of their forces. And there was actually.
And also, Pas de Calais was British for the longest time, on and off.
Is that right?
Yeah, that part of France belonged to the English for the longest time.
Okay. Well, so and again, so that would seem very logical. It's less distance to travel. It's a big port. It's closer to Germany, etc. Mm-hmm. And in fact, the Allies had a deception plan called Operation Fortitude, and there was actually two parts to it, but they were two completely fictitious armies based in England. One to the north that they made it look like they're going to attack Norway, and one in the south that made it look like they're going to attack Pas de Calais.
Wow, that was smart.
It was smart. It's amazing how thorough it was, too, because they had, you have to pretend that there's masses of men and material and army divisions, poised to strike. So that included things like fake tanks, fake landing craft, buildings, even things like radio traffic that wasn't, top secret radio traffic, but just the type of logistical things you're apt to hear when an army's on the move. You have to get this many tons of food and this much gasoline, and so they had all this radio traffic going nonstop. And even after the attack into Normandy, they kept it going, hoping, and successfully hoping in some ways, that they could convince the Germans that the Normandy assault was really just a diversionary tactic. And in fact, after June 6th, for quite a while, they kept a lot of tanks around Pas de Calais because many generals and Hitler were convinced that was just a fake. They were really coming from Pas de Calais, and you needed to keep those tanks there.
That's just crazy that they got attacked in Normandy, and they're insisting on keeping a lot of assets in the Pas de Calais.
And a lot of field generals for Germany, they knew what was going on, and they, disagreed with the higher ups. But disagreeing in Nazi Germany wasn't something that you could just disagree and get your way.
Yes.
And in fact, those tanks by the Pas de Calais were under the direct control of Hitler. They were not allowed to move without his strict authorization. And in fact, on June 6th, when Rommel called for tanks, for a long time the request didn't even get to Hitler because he was sleeping and no one would dare wake him.
Oh, wow.
And so, there's a lot of, when you're a megalomaniac, that comes with a lot of faults, and some of which is just controlling everything, which doesn't really work well in a large army.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's.
And also the first U.S. Army group, which was this fictional group in Operation Fortitude, was supposedly headed by General Patton. And Patton was already really well respected, and everyone thought that he would be the logical Allied commander for an army assault on France. He had been successful in Africa, so the Germans thought he would be too. He was actually somewhat sidelined for political reasons. So that was a great place to put him. We'll put him in charge of this army, and everyone will think that we're attacking Pas-de-Calais.
Yeah, that was it. Yeah. Yeah.
So that's 1944. One question comes up: why was D-Day when it was? And some of the main reasons are weather related. So this was a huge amphibious landing, and they needed the perfect combination of an extremely low tide at dawn, relatively calm seas, clear skies for the paratroopers, and a full moon so that the paratroopers can see. Mm-hmm. And the original plan that they made in 43 was to attack on May 1st of 44, because that had those perfect weather conditions. But the attack ended up growing, and they added a fifth landing beach, and that meant more landing craft and more supplies. And so the whole thing was pushed off actually to June 5th, which was the next perfect conditions. And
right. It was really interesting to me in The Longest Day in the book how he explains that they had to meet requirements, and that these requirements, it just sometimes they weren't there, and that even the Germans were thinking, oh, for sure they're going to attack now because the weather's great. Like,
yes,
and they didn't. And like, what's going on?
Like you say, there's a lot of requirements, and everything has to come into plan perfectly. And bad weather on the 5th meant that it was really untenable to try to do a cross-island assault.
Right, and the low tide had to do with the fact that the Germans had installed so many defenses in the sand. And,
exactly.
And that, any boat going over that low water would blow up.
Exactly. And actually, the Germans expected the Allies to attack at high tide because there's less beach to cover at that point.
Right.
And hence they put all these obstacles that would be buried at high tide. And these were, poles tipped with mines and these huge cross iron structures that would just rip up landing craft. The Allies thought completely differently. They thought, well, because of those, we have to attack at low tide when we can see them and destroy them.
Right.
So, low tide wasn't expected. Right after a storm wasn't expected. So that definitely worked in the Allies' favor.
Yeah.
And eventually, even after a slight false start on June 5th, they chose the date of June 6th. And it wasn't perfect conditions, but they were worried that if we don't do it now, we have to wait a month. And a whole month runs the real risk of the entire invasion being discovered, by spies and things like that. And, at that point, the Germans could bring the tanks to the shore and could likely have defeated it. It was not a sure thing that going in, we would be successful.
Right, and waiting a month had to do with the moon because they needed the light of the moon to...
The light of the moon, and I think the moon also affects, how...
The tide
cycles and how extreme they are.
Yeah.
So, if it wasn't June 6th, it would have been, July. So Dwight Eisenhower, who was the supreme commander of the Allied Expeditionary Force, in the end, he got opinions from all his generals, but it came down to him. And he said, we're going to do it. Bernard Montgomery was in charge of the ground forces. He was a UK general who was also very successful in Africa. He went for it. The air command was a little less enthusiastic. And the naval command as well. But in the end, they decided June 6th is the day. Mm-hmm.
And they decided right at the time. I mean, it's not like they decided 2 weeks before. They decided right as it was coming up.
Yeah, I mean, they had a date a year before. That got pushed off a month. And then that gets pushed off, like you say, the night before you have to go. And they already had the men in the ships in the channel, because it takes a long time to load up that many ships. So they were ready to go. And there was the other question of if you have to take them back and refuel, now you've got to unload the ships, reload them, et cetera. Yeah. And the scale of this attack was just amazing. And we'll talk a little later about the numbers involved.
It's amazing. It's amazing how much was involved.
So the attack itself, like I said, was mostly the UK and the United States. The Russians had their hands full in the east, but it was also Canada was a large part of it. There were some forces from Australia, New Zealand, and many forces from some of the smaller countries that had already been occupied, but the soldiers escaped before occupation. So there were soldiers from Belgium, Czechoslovakia, Denmark, many Free French were involved in it, including paratroopers, the Netherlands, etc., Norway, Poland, a lot of Polish soldiers there. And in fact, when you go to Normandy today and you see some of the British cemeteries, the U.S. cemetery only puts U.S. soldiers there, but the British cemeteries puts people from various countries, including some Germans. But you'll see a lot of headstones that are a little different, and they're for Polish soldiers or Norwegian or Greek soldiers, etc.
Yeah, because they don't have. I mean, they didn't lose enough people to have a whole big cemetery to themselves.
Yeah, and a lot of times the occupied country soldiers were really working under the command of one of the free countries as well. So Normandy itself, again, the Germans didn't know exactly where the attack was coming, so they basically had to try to protect from northern Norway all the way down to Spain on the Atlantic, which is 2,000 miles coastline. And Hitler had what he called his Atlantic Wall that he claimed was impregnable to an attack. And it was, quite daunting. It was this huge construction project. They used, mostly slave labor and POWs and conscripted French civilians to build it. I think less than 10% of the labor actually came from Germany. But there were over 250,000 men involved in building this. And, there were gun emplacements, huge gun emplacements, concrete, steel reinforced concrete. Some of the guns were huge and located inland, but they had forward observers on the coast so that they could reach many miles out to sea and take out ships.
Right, and you can still see some of the construction that those guns were in.
Oh yeah, lots of the construction actually. Yeah. I read a spec that there were 17 million metric meters of concrete poured.
Oh wow! For
the Atlantic Wall and 1.2 million tons of steel, and those just don't go away overnight. So there's gun emplacements. There are large ones, small ones. You'll walk near the beach and you may see a small machine gun turret, with a pit that a man could be inside, just poking his head over the top. And you'll see gigantic gun emplacements with, concrete many meters thick. A lot of the ones that were set right on the coast, the larger guns were actually positioned crossfire so that they could, there's a crossfire pattern so they had overlapping fire. So there was, if you got behind one obstacle to get away from one gun, there was another gun that could see you.
Right.
And the openings for these guns didn't point out to the sea and were invisible from the sea. So they're very hard to attack from the Navy. And it made the beaches just treacherous.
Right.
And as you mentioned, various contraptions on the beaches. They had mine-tipped poles. They had these things called Belgian gates. You see pictures back then at low tide, and it's not a beach you'd want to go to.
Yes. I have some historical pictures of that. I'll try to put some on the show notes. It's frightening how much they turned the whole place into just a war field.
Fortress.
A fortress.
I think he called it a Fortress Europa was Hitler's term for Europe in general.
Yeah.
And even inland, on some fields that they thought they could land planes or gliders, they planted these things they called them Rommel's asparagus, because Edwin Rommel was in charge of the defenses. And they'd be these huge poles that just stuck up out of the ground so that a glider that came in would just be ripped apart by it. There was no open land area.
Wow.
And inland from Utah Beach, there was a lot of lowland that was drained through a series of dikes. Well, they ended up reversing those dikes and actually flooding the areas so that paratroopers or planes couldn't land there, or if they did, they would drown. So Edwin Rommel was the German general in charge of this, and when he came in charge of it, he found the defenses lacking and really ramped up construction. And there's another theory that had they had another month or two to build up these defenses, it would have been even more daunting.
Yep.
So behind the defenses was Normandy, which is a beautiful, rural area with rolling hills, small cleared farm fields, even smaller fields than you see today, because a lot of the smaller fields have since been opened up into larger fields for, mechanized farming. But all these little fields, little villages with, a church and a few houses around it. A few of the larger towns like Caen and Bayeux were really the hubs, the transportation, commercial hubs of the areas. One other thing, I think we kind of mentioned this, but Normandy in general, not just based on the moon, has an extreme of high and low tides because of the narrowness of the English Channel.
Right.
So, the tide, when it goes out, it goes way out.
Yeah.
And if you go there today at low tide and you look how far somebody would have to land in a landing craft and get all the way, to the shore, it's a long distance.
Mm-hmm.
And I will say that most of the beaches, it was just gently rolling behind the beach. But Omaha itself had some very high bluffs overlooking the beach. So that gave the Germans a strategic advantage. The only way to get a vehicle off the beach was one of four, what they called them, draws or exits from the beach.
Mm-hmm.
And that was really the only way for vehicular traffic off the beach. And that was, the plan was we need to take these exits.
Yeah.
So Omaha Beach had hills, Utah Beach had flooded areas. Although the Germans weren't totally expecting it there, they did have huge garrisons of men. And behind them, the French citizens, most of whom had been moved out of the immediate coastal area. But there was, an active French resistance everywhere in France, but certainly in Normandy.
Mm-hmm.
And I think you had sent me some notes. You did some research on the French resistance there.
Yeah, I did. You want me to talk about that now?
Sure.
Okay. These are things that I didn't really know myself. I mean, you studied this in school in France, but it was extremely dangerous to join the resistance because the Germans were really ruthless in hunting them down and killing them right away. I mean, it was like public execution, bullet in the head in front of your wife and kids kind of thing.
Yes.
And so it really scared people. And so only 2 to 3% of French people ever joined the resistance officially. There were a lot more who would help out as soon as they realized that they were dealing with a resistance group. But these groups were so secretive that they didn't know each other's names, real names. Occasionally, they happened to know each other from some other social or school or something, but they didn't use anybody's real names because they didn't want people to be able to give up who else was in the group if caught and tortured.
Yes.
And they had very strange ways of working. So they had radio stations that would broadcast sentences that, I mean, they were good French, but it made no sense. So you'd have a guy saying something like, Monsieur Durand a perdu son vélo dans l'étang, which means Mr. Durand has lost his bicycle in the pond. And then they would pause for a second. And then they would say, Madame, I don't know, whatever name, souhaite un bon anniversaire à sa belle-sœur Gisèle. So Mrs. So-and-so wishes a happy birthday to her sister-in-law, Gisèle. And just sentences and sentences and sentences like this. And it was hard for the Germans to know what the heck they meant. It was just...
Probably because most of them meant nothing.
Right. Most of them were... It's like the classified, maybe, in a way. It's like if you read like the classified, but every now and then you put in there something that means something to one of these groups, right? And so all they knew is, they didn't know what the grand plan was, but they knew when I hear the sentence, and the specific sentence, that means this.
I mean, and I may take this action based on that.
That's right.
Cutting a telephone pole or something like that.
That's right. And so that's how they communicated. And they had leaders who would pass around messages. But most of the time, the leaders themselves didn't know what the message meant. They just knew that this is something they had to take action with. When they heard that, they had to take action. And
the other thing, too, is that I think most of these were broadcast by the UK, but it was illegal for French citizens to have radios.
Correct.
The Germans wanted to control all communication. And so, just having a radio in your house was a punishable offense.
Was
and
very dangerous. Very dangerous.
So you had old ones that were hidden or ones you constructed yourself. You'd leave up in the hayloft. And the Germans would even patrol the area with these vehicles that were equipped to detect radio receivers. And you probably wouldn't still be living there after they found one with you.
Yep. So here's a sentence that was really significant. That when a lot of these groups heard it, they knew that D-Day was on, and it says something like "Les sanglots longs des violons de l'automne blessent mon cœur d'une langueur monotone," and that came from a poem by Verlaine that had nothing to do with war. And the quote isn't exactly the poem either. It's the poem that had been put to a song, and it was a popular song at the time, and so people would recognize that, and it just had lots of people in the resistance knew it means it's on today.
Yes.
And it was really interesting how they communicated and how even after the resistance, there were many people who, because having been in the resistance meant that you could apply for benefits like
after the war. It gave you stature that
exactly. And so lots of people who weren't in the resistance tried to apply for that. And there were big fights afterwards. It was just a messy time. And I'm impressed the people who were able to do as much as they did, and especially the ones who survived.
Survived.
Yeah.
How many didn't survive? We don't know.
They say that 40% of the people who joined were dead within the first year.
Wow.
So that's it's a high kill rate kind of thing. And so it was really, really dangerous. And the Germans had no compunction over, I'll shoot your wife if I suspect that you
can give me more information if you watch her being threatened to die,
Yeah. No, they were awful. And, it's war. I mean, but those were very hard times.
Yes. So this was Normandy, the way the Allies and the Germans saw it in June of 1944. And the final plan for assaulting the coast or assaulting Normandy, and I'm using the word assault rather than invasion. I think I mentioned this to you before. In the U.S. and I imagine the U.K., we refer to it as a D-Day invasion. Mm-hmm. But I found when I go to Normandy, they find that term very peculiar because they didn't see us as invaders. They saw us as liberators.
Yep.
The Germans were the invaders.
Yep.
And I'm sure we meant we're invading German-occupied Europe, but the term isn't used around Normandy. So I call it an assault or an attack or something like that.
And
liberation is what they call it.
It's a liberation. But the thing is, for the French soldiers who were involved in D-Day, they had to shoot at their own country,
Yes.
And so this is not something that soldiers...
Wasn't as easy for them.
Exactly. It's not, and you don't know necessarily who you're shooting at, but you're supposed to shoot at anything that moves. I'm not sure, I don't have any knowledge of how war works, but I'm assuming if they say, take this area and shoot anything that moves, well, you got to do it.
Yeah, there's a house that they think maybe there are Germans in. Maybe there aren't. Maybe there are some French civilians and they have to shoot at that or something. And the civilians suffered awfully. When we talk about numbers a little bit later, I think I have some numbers on how many casualties and fatalities they had. Mm-hmm. They actually had more, the French citizens had more casualties from the Allied forces than from the Germans. Because, we had to take a town and it was a French town and it was occupied by Germans. But that means we bomb it from the air. We use artillery on the ground.
That's right.
And the Germans weren't in the town executing all the French there. They were trying to fight the Allies coming towards them. So the French suffered, huge. And it's sobering when you go there to see that despite that, how much they respect the Allies for what they did and for liberating them. Which has to point to how bad things were under German rule.
Yeah, it was terrible. They really wanted the Germans out.
Yes. So the final plan to attack the continent involved a number of things. There were almost 40 army divisions as part of the attack. Now, an army division is about 10 to 15,000 men per division. Mm-hmm. There was over 7,700 bomber aircraft. And really, the attack started the night before with a pre-invasion bombardment by over 2,200 of those bombers and sabotage conducted by the French resistance. Now, in the weeks leading up to it, there was a lot of bombing, but they couldn't specifically bomb Normandy because that would have played their hand. People would have known, that's where they're coming. Mm-hmm. So they had to bomb all over the country and try to strategically get some places in Normandy. But on the night of June 5th itself, they concentrated all their bombing right there. So that was the first part of the plan. The next part of the plan is to have mine-sweeping naval craft go across English Channel, because the Germans had the whole channel mined, and you had to clear paths for the ships to go. And the plan was to attack 5 different beaches, and they all had code names from west to east. They were Utah Beach and Omaha Beach, which were the American beaches, Gold Beach, which was British, Juno, which was Canadian and British, and Sword, which is British. And these beaches are about 50 miles apart as the crow flies.
Right.
And there's not really a road straight between them. If you go between the beaches, you usually have to go inland, take a major road, then go back towards the coast. So it's a gigantic area. And I will, just kind of a side note, I sometimes see on forums people saying they want to go visit Normandy for a day. And I always caution against it, because, it's a huge, huge area to see. There was a lot that happened in a lot of different places.
Yeah.
And you can go to a couple highlights, but you'll spend most of your day getting there and back, and there's just so much more to see there.
Yeah. If you have a day, you'll see maybe one of the beaches, or maybe the one American cemetery or something.
Yeah, the one American cemetery and Omaha Beach, and those are great to see, but there's so much more. Yeah. Utah Beach was actually added much later in the planning stages, and that was a reason for the delay from May to June. But Eisenhower felt they needed another beach, a larger width of an area to divert the Germans over. And the attack was to be made at first light and at low tide. And the actual attack plan was minute-by-minute timing of craft. First, this landing craft, first, these amphibious tanks, which, believe it or not, they developed, would land. And then this landing craft will land with engineers, and they can start blowing up the obstructions. And then this infantry will come, 4 minutes later and start going through. And then, just all these minute-by-minute timing of craft and men. And, of course, the night before, let me back up a little bit, they dropped paratroopers, or the plan was to drop paratroopers on the flanks, on the east and west. So nothing inside of Gold Beach or Omaha Beach, but outside of Utah Beach and outside of Sword Beach. They had Americans to the west and British to the east to protect the flanks. I think there were 2 American divisions and 1 British division, something like that. And they were really charged with, protecting against counterattacks, capturing bridges, disrupting communications, and wreaking havoc. And that's just the initial attack. So you've got, people hitting the beach, the paratroopers holding the flanks, and then you have to follow this up. You can't simply, put a couple divisions on the beach and say we occupy Europe. So the constant battle for days on end is to resupply them. And I just saw a couple stats that I thought were very interesting. They estimated that in the first 20 days of the Battle of Normandy, they'd require 5,000 tons of gasoline just for the trucks and tanks. And this one I thought was interesting, because they're requisitioning everything from food to tires to cots, medical supplies. 300 billion units of penicillin.
Wow.
That's just one little thing that somebody was in charge of requisitioning.
It's crazy that all the planning that had to go into this, they had to line all these ducks in a row is perfectly right, or it wasn't going to work. And just the staging area in England must have been just mind-boggling. Because
they had these huge places where they put men and material, and they called them sausages, because on a map, the bottom of them would be by the ports, but there were so many people you couldn't put everything by the ports, so they'd extend well inland, and each little staging area, looked like a long sausage leading towards the port.
That is just crazy.
The logistics planning, I can't imagine what that was like.
Well, especially back then, because maybe it was easier back then because they had fewer ways of communication. But can you imagine today if you were trying to pull off a thing like that? I sent it to you in a,
email attachment.
Any email attachment that nobody ever saw, or we went through a Slack channel or something, and people missed. I mean, it's just the management of the thing is just, I can't imagine.
Supply side economics, I guess you'd call it today.
Yeah.
So that was the plan. Now, here's the invasion. One of the most dramatic things, and one of the very first things that happened in the invasion, actually happened just a couple minutes after midnight on June 5th. And when I read about this, I was just boggled. And so airborne consists not only of paratroopers who parachute to ground, but gliders. Mm-hmm. And these gliders were huge, and they'd be loaded with men and material, and they'd be towed across the English Channel. And when they cut loose, this, multi-ton thing would glide to the earth. There's something called Operation Pegasus on the eastern end that was handled by the British Airborne, where they took these 3 huge Horsa gliders and they crash landed them at the base of a bridge. And it was a real key bridge they needed that went over the Caen Canal. Mm-hmm. And, most bridges were guarded and ready to be exploded. They were, they were demolition charges. So if you couldn't keep it, you blow it up so that your enemy can't use it. And both sides would do that. Mm-hmm. So they knew they had to take this bridge, and they had to take it really fast. So they crash landed these huge gliders about 50 feet or 50 yards from the base of the bridge. These British paratroopers come pouring out, and within minutes, they had this bridge. Now, they had to hold it, of course, against counterattacks until people come from the ocean. But that was just an amazing, first success of D-Day.
Just fast action. They knew exactly what they wanted to do is the thing. They had a good plan that was really well executed, but you have to have the good plan too, otherwise.
Yes, and you have to have both good plan and good soldiers. And the paratroopers were certainly a level above. You got booted out of the paratroopers if you could pull your weight. Mm-hmm. So these were definitely elite fighting forces. And I think Major was the name of the British commander in charge of this. I'll have to look that up. But he executed. He and his men executed perfectly. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So shortly thereafter, paratroopers landed to mark what they call Pathfinder paratroopers landed well inland to mark the landing zones for the rest of the paratroopers. And they used beacons, they used some lights. They couldn't draw a lot of attention, but they had some pretty, at the time, top secret navigation devices. Mm-hmm. And
no GPS, though.
No GPS, no night vision either. And shortly thereafter, over 20,000 paratroopers descended from the air, under parachute, loaded with equipment. Some of them had over 100 pounds of equipment on them, which they learned later was you just can't go walking around with 100 pounds. But that was kind of learning experiences. Mm-hmm. And unfortunately, despite all the perfect plans, many of the paratroopers landed off target. Some even landed so far away as to land in the ocean and die. Some landed right in the middle of a German installation and were shot down or captured immediately without having any battle. And so that was really bad. The aircraft were scattered mostly because of ground fire and inexperienced pilots that, you're told to just fly steady and straight. But that's probably very hard to do when people are shooting at you and things are exploding and all around you.
Can't imagine.
But some of this misdrop actually had some benefit because it caused a lot of confusion in the German high command. Because, we get a report that there's 10 men over here, and we just captured these 2 soldiers here, and they were just all over the countryside. It was hard to look at it from the German perspective and say, they're trying to capture this town, or, this is their plan. And no one had landed by the ocean yet. And another part of this, too, is that the Allies dropped 2 things. One was like this tin foil type material that would confuse the radar. You just kind of see a cloud of radar activity. You don't know what it is. And they also dropped these 2-foot-high dummy paratroopers. And they weren't lifelike or anything, but from a distance at night, you just see the silhouette of a parachute and a paratrooper coming down. Mm-hmm. And they're rigged to have these fireworks go off when they hit ground. So, you see things coming, and they hit the ground, there's a bunch of gunshots. You think, well, there's a bunch of...
they thought they were thousands and thousands of people.
Yeah, and then, to make it even worse, the Germans would advance and find the dummy parachutists, report that they're dummy parachutists, and then the higher commanders would doubt everything they'd hear. They go, I hear there's dummy parachutes being dropped everywhere. So maybe a place where there are real paratroopers, they doubted those reports.
Right. So they say, it's the dummy stuff. Oh my goodness, that's just.
So it definitely caused confusion behind the lines, which was one of the goals of
they wanted to do.
Yeah, keep them off guard. Mm-hmm. So that's kind of the initial airborne assault. The next stage was the coastal bombardment. And they had all these bombers coming across the channel to bomb the coastal guns to kind of neutralize the German coastal defenses and allow us to get inland. And unfortunately, the bulk of these were ineffective because of an incident where they they bombed on their own people in Italy. They dropped bombs right on their own landing craft. The bombers were really reluctant. They waited a little too long. Some have waited up to 30 seconds. And, if you're flying an aircraft for 30 seconds, you cover a lot of ground. Mm-hmm. And most of the coastal defenses simply were not hit on the night of D-Day. Mm-hmm. We thought they were hit. The people landing on the shore thought they were hit. But when they landed, they found out very differently.
Yeah, that they were functioning.
Yeah, and I think nowhere was this worse than Omaha Beach. Mm-hmm. Because some of the first landing troops to land were I think it's the 29th Infantry Division. There was a 29th and the 1st Infantry Division on Omaha Beach. The 29th landed in the western sector, if I'm correct, and they hit at 6:30 a.m. Mm-hmm. And they expected to have amphibious tanks out in front of them. This wacky British inventor had invented all these crazy modifications to the American Sherman tank. Okay. One of them was a tank that could float, not well, but it could float, and it had a propeller. And if you dropped it off a landing craft, the idea was get the tanks in to shore. And infantry works well with tanks. The infantry follows behind the tanks. The tanks take out the bigger emplacements. Well, the seas were rough, and the commanders wanted to land the tanks too far out to sea. And as these things went off the landing craft, almost every one of them immediately sunk. They were just watching them come off the landing craft and sink. And 27 out of 32 amphibious tanks in the American sector sunk instantly.
So that didn't work.
And the other ones, they got in, but there's only a few, and they're quickly bombed and pinned down by beach artillery. So they were just obstructions at that point.
Yeah, that was a big gamble.
It was a huge gamble. And
dropping tanks out of the sky is not an easy proposition.
These tanks weighed tons and tons. They did better in the British and Canadian sectors, mostly because they brought them closer to shore there. And I believe the American ones that did make it, the commander of the landing craft was ordered at gunpoint to bring them closer in, because the seas, the further you got out in the sand, in the channel, the seas were rougher.
Mm-hmm. Of course, yeah.
So all these carefully laid plans we talked about of minute-by-minute landings, tanks, engineers, infantry, etc., quickly fell apart. Mm-hmm. And the very first troops that landed at Omaha were just slaughtered. Very few were able to continue the fight at all. Some landing craft were blown out of the water before they hit the shore. Men were shot just as they left the landing craft or on their way up the beach. These crossfire guns from the sides and bluffs of Omaha Beach just destroyed people. And it was just a shooting gallery for the Germans. Mm-hmm. And a lot of the men would, a long way up the beach, you get to the high tide mark, was what they call a shingles, just kind of a rocky area that, the tide doesn't go beyond there. Mm-hmm. And so men would move up to the shingle, and from there they would be protected from direct gunfire. A few men deep could maybe hide and not get hit directly by a bullet. But then the Germans had mortars that knew those locations exactly. Yeah. And they dropped mortar charges right on top of them. So there they are sitting where they feel the safest you can feel. And in reality, the longer you stay there, the closer you're going to come to dying, because it's unsurvivable at that point.
That's so terrible. So what percentage do you think were killed of that first wave of...
I'd have to look up on the 29th Infantry. It was a huge percentage of, and the Army refers to it as casualties, not necessarily killed. A casualty is killed, wounded, missing, or captured. Yeah. All it means is they're of no use to the Army anymore. Yeah. Not that the Army doesn't care whether you're killed or not, but they want to know how many men they have that can continue fighting. Yeah. And the vast majority were casualties on Omaha Beach, and particularly in I think it was the Dog Red sector over towards the west of Omaha Beach. And I don't know the exact number, but it basically ceased to exist as a fighting force. Yeah. And the engineers who were supposed to clear the obstacles were among those casualties. So now the tide's coming in, or reinforcements are coming in. The obstacles aren't cleared. You're piling up men and material on the beach. You don't have the exits captured, which I think they expected to be captured within the first hour. And the beach quickly just got clogged. You'd bring a truck in or a tank, and it would get bombed, and now it's just an obstruction. Or it can't get through the other obstructions. You've got casualty, you've got dead men floating in the water, you've got wounded people up against embankments. It looked extremely grim at Omaha Beach. And because of the fog of war, the Allies out in the sea couldn't really tell what was going on. They could tell it wasn't going well. Everything was covered in smoke. They weren't getting reports of anybody successfully taking their objectives.
Well, and they could certainly see that the Germans kept firing their guns, and so obviously those hadn't been taken out.
And they were even told, don't send any more vehicles here because we can't get off the beach. So all you're doing is clogging the beach.
Yeah.
And they stopped delivering vehicles at one point in the morning and considered abandoning Omaha Beach because it just seemed like you were just sending men and material in to be destroyed, and no success was being made by it. They weren't exactly sure out in the Navy, but they discussed it. They discussed, should we just stop this? There was no real plan for evacuation. You land on the beach, you either succeed or you're killed or captured. But the only thought is keep more men from being killed and captured. So it was terrible, and it was terrible for most of the day there. The other beaches did a little better. Did a lot better, but not to say they were easy walks in the park. There were a lot of German defenses there.
Yeah.
But the Canadians and the English largely got off the beach and did hook up with one another. Over on Utah Beach, they actually landed in the wrong spot about a mile east of or southeast of where they were supposed to. And there was a commander there who was General Roosevelt, who was the son of Theodore Roosevelt, who had basically, I think he was the highest ranking officer to land on the beach. And he talked them into doing it. And it kind of embarrassed them, saying, you can't tell ex-president's son that he can't go in with the men. So he took charge there. And there was a question of, well, do we tell the follow-up troops to follow us or tell them to go to the right spot? And he said, we need to start, basically his words were, we're going to start the war right here.
Wow.
And they had, they had much less casualties, and they were able to overwhelm the Germans right on the coast, relatively quickly. So the center of it, Omaha, was really the worst of all of it. And the fighting for Omaha really went on all day long. They couldn't see these gun emplacements that well from out at sea, so they had some destroyers that sailed in dangerously close to the shore, ran a severe risk of grounding, just so they could fire directly upon these gun emplacements. And it was, if you ground, you're dead because now you can't move. They're going to shoot you. So the plan to take Omaha Beach by going up these 4 heavily defended exits just didn't work. But gradually, small units that got sick of being shot at or were encouraged by higher-ups to, assault up the bluff wouldn't go up the road, but would just climb these bluffs directly. 2 units here and, 10 people here. And they slowly got up the bluff and found that from behind, the Germans were defending the shore, but they weren't covering their back that well. So they were slowly throughout the day able to take the beach. And it was at a huge cost and a huge loss. But they did take it. They got up to the bluff. One part of the bluff is where the Normandy American Cemetery is today. And you can look down from that cemetery and see, if you look at low tide, you can see how far out they were and how far they had to come to actually capture these.
It's quite unfathomable that they did that. When you're there and you try to imagine what happened, you're like, what? Like, how did they ever think this could work? But it did eventually, at great cost, but it did.
It did, and it didn't work exactly like they planned, but it worked through the perseverance of the individual soldier, the individual unit commander that would just, keep pushing rather than giving up and just try to find a way. And it was, the innovation of soldiers. Now, I've never been in the military, but from all I've read, plans always fall apart once the battle starts. You have to have a plan, but once it started, you have to be adaptable. And those who were adaptable made it succeed.
Right.
So then, if you look back from the shore, the airborne units, the British had captured the Pegasus Bridge, and they eventually hooked up with the British coming in from Sword Beach. The 82nd Airborne were scattered, but landed with more precision than a lot of airborne. And they took this town called St. Mary-Glisse, which is a wonderful little town. It was not that big a town, but it was kind of a crossroads for several important places and where they expected counterattacks might come. So they actually took that on June 6th, and they consider that the first town liberated on D-Day.
Wow.
The 101st Airborne landed between them and the shore, and they ended up linking up with the U.S. 4th Division that came in from Utah Beach. They had that flooded area, but they had these 4 causeways that were above the flooded area, and they were able to capture them and get the troops and get the tanks off the beach, and then the tanks and airborne hooked up. So by the end of the day, they basically had 3 footholds in France. There was a British-Canadian foothold, there was Omaha Beach, and there was Utah Beach. But these 3 were not connected. So they still had to move inland. It wasn't all done on D-Day, but they had to keep men moving in. They had to keep vehicles moving in. And I saw some stats that by June 11th, which is 5 days later, they had landed almost 1/3 troops, 54,000 vehicles, and these all came in over sea, and 104,000 tons of supplies.
Wow.
And they had to keep that up for quite some time.
Right. Wow.
Yeah. Wow is all you can say. The more you learn about it and the more you see those areas.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this was not an easy take. I mean, they didn't pick places where you could, you just walk in and...
Walks in, yeah.
No, it wasn't anything like that.
Yeah. So there's a lot of significant battles around it. We talked about some. Omaha Beach was probably the bloodiest. There's a place to the west of there called Pointe du Hoc, it was a German gun emplacement, or so we thought, that was at the top of a cliff. And we thought they had guns there that could basically reach Omaha Beach and Utah Beach. And there was no beach below it. It was just a cliff going into the sea. And they had a U.S. Ranger unit landed at the base of the cliff, fired hooks up the cliff with ropes, scaled the cliff. Now, you've got defenders up with machine guns and hand grenades. They climbed a cliff and captured this area. And
you have to be insane to do something like that. Or on drugs. I mean, this is the kind of stuff you see in movies. And in movies, they make it look like, oh, it's so easy. But they did it for real.
They did it for real and suffered heavily in the process. Mm-hmm. And because it took them a little longer, I think the plan was that the follow-up Rangers, if they took Pointe du Hoc, they were to fire a flare or somehow signal that they had taken it. And then they know the follow-ups should reinforce them. If the follow-ups didn't get that indication, well, rather than slaughtering more people, they were diverted to Omaha Beach. Mm-hmm. And because it took them a little longer than normal, or it was either that or they had lack of communication, they had no follow-ups. So the other Rangers went to Omaha Beach, and these Rangers were at the top of Pointe du Hoc for, I think, a couple days, and just had to hold it alone. And if you go there today, it was heavily bombed the night before and preceding D-Day. And you'll see these huge craters, gigantic concrete reinforced bunkers. Some are caved in, some are not, and huge craters. And you can look over the cliff, and you can't imagine that you have to assault this from the sea. Yeah.
Yeah, and these are, for people who might be visiting with children, I think kids, it's a good visual for kids. And also they get their wiggles out because they can climb around and
run. Yeah, and that's, the bunkers themselves, it's kind of odd because these were, evil military machines. And you think, oh, why would you bring a kid there? But at least it is something physical. There's sights.
Yeah, by now it's not evil military. I mean, you know what was there, but...
Yes. And you can even see in some of them, like where the German soldiers lived, because it wasn't all just sitting behind a machine gun turret. They had to live and eat their meals and things like that.
Yeah. And so the biggest place to see that is Pointe du Hoc, right?
Well, there are a lot of places. Pointe du Hoc is big. There's a lot of big gun emplacements north of Utah Beach.
Yeah, okay.
And Azoville. And then there's some over on the British sector as well. I forget the name of them.
Azoville, how do you spell that?
Azeville.
Okay, Azeville. Okay.
And that's a great one because there's a lot of intact bunkers, intact rooms where the soldiers lived.
That's going to be the one I remember then.
Yeah, it's inland. You can see the ocean over the distant horizon, but you wouldn't be able to fire with direct eyesight at any ships out there. So they had to have people communicating from the shore. Mm-hmm. There's one other battle that I want to mention because it was really fierce, and I think it was June 7th, 8th. And this was just to the west of Saint-Mère-Église. And I think technically it's in Saint-Mère-Église, but there's the Merderet River, that flows west of St. Mary-Glisse. And
the what, sorry?
the Mer de Ret? M-E-R...
La Mer de Ré.
Yeah.
Spell it.
M-E-R-D-E-R-E-T, I think.
Okay.
And there was big flooded fields on either side because the Germans flooded that, and it was just kind of floodplain anyway. And there was a bridge that they had to take. And at the time, there were no trees on either side. So just approaching this bridge on these causeways, you were completely exposed. And this was extremely important to the U.S., extremely important to the Germans. And the 82nd Airborne was charged with taking it. And the battle raged there for a couple days. People were just so exposed from artillery and gunfire from the other side that either side would just get slaughtered on this. And they did eventually capture it and went on to the next town, whose name I forget, but that kind of secured the western flank of the American Cotentin Peninsula. And to this day, on the anniversary of June 6th, or the nearest Sunday to that, there's a big celebration there where the U.S. and French and a bunch of countries' military paratroopers land right there on the river plain. There's these huge hayfields there, and reenactors land there as well. And there's a big audience, but they'll just have plane after plane of military landing there. They once had the U.S. ambassador to France did a tandem skydive into that area. But it's appropriate for that, and it's appropriate because it was the battle with so much grit and determination that was taken by the Air soldiers.
Wow.
Beyond D-Day, which I said we'd talk about maybe the week following, but I think we've covered a lot of ground just getting into D-Day in the next day or two. But the battle still had to extend. They still hadn't taken Caen until, I think, July 21st. They were supposed to take it the first day, and it took almost 6 weeks to take that.
Wow.
Charenton fell on June 12th. Saint Lo was sometime after that. So they'd get to these towns and have to, that would be more of like central command Germans, and they'd have to take these larger towns. And unfortunately, a lot of those towns just got destroyed because there'd be bombardments, there'd be artillery, and
if you want to take a town, you have to bomb it.
Yeah, unfortunately, and that's where a lot of the French casualties occurred. Caen was just wiped out; it was just flattened, and so many people died there. One of the few towns that kind of escaped, and it was a little bit smaller, was Bayeux. And it's still a kind of medieval half-timbered town, and for some reason the Germans didn't use it. And so it wasn't bombed, and it's one of the few preserved ones. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a good place to go see what Normandy looked like before.
Yes, absolutely.
Yep.
So that's what I know about D-Day and the immediate aftermath of that.
It's amazing.
It really is amazing. And when you look at some of the numbers, they're truly amazing, too. When you look at the entire Normandy campaign, so D-Day until August 21st, when Paris was liberated, they are estimated to be 500,000 German casualties, about half of which were killed. American casualties were about 125,000, of whom 20,000 were killed. English, Canadian, were 83,000 casualties, 15,000 killed. French citizens, about 13,000 to 20,000 were killed, and many more seriously wounded. There is a cost to war, and maybe you visit these places to remind us why we should do everything we can to avoid that sort of thing in the future.
Yeah. Yep. Wow. And it's surprising when you go to Normandy, the kind of gratitude you still feel. And I don't think they're putting on airs. I think it's very genuine.
It really is.
Yeah. The people who you talk to, the locals who you talk to, just they will tell you that they haven't forgotten and that it was amazing and that they are so grateful. And there's still groups of people who notice that there's some American graves or British graves or whatever nationality that don't get taken care of. And so there's groups that get together and go put flowers and take care of graves and stuff. It's just amazing how much gratitude you can still feel to this day.
Yes, and it's not just people after your tourist dollar. I mean, sure, the restaurant, you could be suspicious and say, well, sure, they want the American and Brits to spend money there, but you see it in people's front yards and on little kids' bicycles, and you'll see a UK flag or a US flag or something.
Well,
and these aren't people, for the most part. I mean, there aren't many people alive that were still alive then. There are some. Yeah. But you see gratitude from people that weren't alive then, but obviously the stories have been passed down from their families. It was
probably their grandpa, their uncle, their, people like that. And French families are pretty tight, I mean, usually. And you will hear stories, and maybe they hear more stories today than they did 20 years ago, because the closer you are to an event like that, the less you tend to talk about it. And so...
Yeah. And I think also the rural communities tend to be a little closer, a little more dependent on each other than the cities too. And most of Normandy is very rural.
Yeah.
So you have a lot of these organizations that I know you've mentioned before that it's kind of a French thing to do, to join an organization or group that gets involved in a particular activity or something. And there are a lot of organizations there that are really dedicated to the remembrance of these events. If you go to the first time I went to the Normandy American Cemetery, I saw French school children on probably a field trip being led around to show and be taught the history. I don't know exactly what was being said because I don't speak French, but it was nice to see the appreciation. And
I was very surprised to hear one of they have these little tourist information kind of booths, and the lady we talked to, I mean, I'm French, so I speak French, and I was speaking to her in French, and she said, yes, go see the American cemetery, go see all of these things that we had planned. We had made a list, and she said, but also go to a German cemetery.
Yes.
And I was like, really? And she said, you will see how young they were.
Yeah, they were. And I mean,
it's shocking. It's really I mean, all of them were very young. Well, most of them.
Most soldiers in general, certainly infantry, frontline soldiers were young, but some of the Germans were, would be too young to even legally be a soldier in the U.S.
Some of them were 16, 17, And
there's a big German cemetery in, I think it's called Le Camp. It's right off the large auto route between Omaha Beach and Utah Beach.
Yeah.
And you can see the entrance. And so a lot of people visit it to see what that's like. But I went to another one once that was a lot further west than St. Mariglis, in a town, I'm just doing this by memories, Orlandges, Orlandges, I think.
Say that again?
It's Orlandges.
Orlandges. Okay.
I think that I'm just doing this from memory, so I'm not spelling. But there were much fewer people there. It was very sobering, and what they had is rather than like the U.S. and U.K. cemeteries where there's one marker per soldier, they had 6 soldiers per marker in the German one. And very often, 4 out of those 6 would just say in German, an unknown German soldier. They didn't even know who it was.
Yeah.
They're buried there. And they had the U.S. Normandy cemetery is just shy of 10,000 soldiers buried there. The one down on the Brittany border is about 5,000. That German one has 20,000 soldiers in it.
Yeah.
And I think the one by the auto route near Omaha Beach also has 20,000.
Yeah, I can't remember which one we went to see, but it was just so sad to see. I mean, all of these cemeteries are sobering and sad, but by now Europe has moved on. We don't risk anything from German invasion.
No, you're allies.
Right, we're allies, and we're probably allies forever now. But
But part of that may be because people look at these lessons and found out to repeat them.
Yes, and that's one of the big reasons why there were politicians in Europe not very long after World War II who started saying we have to build a European Union because that's the only way to avoid this sort of war from coming back again. Because it wasn't, World War II was not the first time this happened between France and Germany. It happened in World War I. It happened in 1878, I think. It happened before, It was just something that just happened over and over again, and we don't want that.
And has all through history all over the world.
Yes.
But the more you look at it, the more you learn from it, and the more you try to understand the other side. Hopefully, I'm not going to say we're going to get rid of all wars going forward, but if we can at least reduce them, that's a benefit, and that starts with education.
Yeah, but if I can get just a tiny bit preachy, you have to be careful with ideology, because a lot of countries these days tend to vote for people who are very good at riling people up.
Yes.
And I'm saying in Europe too, and that's very dangerous.
It can be.
It can be very, very dangerous, because the Germans by now have admitted that there was an ideology that was really attractive to them, because it put them high on a pedestal. It made them top of the world, and people like to be top of the world. I mean,
But another part of that too is that it's easy to rile people up when they feel like they're at the bottom of the world. And
yes.
World War I basically begat World War II, because the Treaty of Versailles put such onerous punishments on Germany and debts that, they just felt like, well, we have nothing else. We can't possibly succeed this way. So when you hear a guy like Hitler telling you, oh, there's another path, they went to believe him.
Yeah.
And that was one lesson from World War I that was played out after World War II when they had the Marshall Plan,
right?
Which met some resistance, but it was like, we can't just leave these countries beat down and in poverty,
right?
Because they'll just rise up again to battle.
That's right.
So we invested in what had previously been our enemies in Germany, in Austria, in Japan, and now they're some of our best allies.
That's right.
So
that's right. And so let's hope that nothing like this ever happens again. I don't think it could happen like it did on D-Day. But it's just stunning the sacrifice that people made, and that the effort, like it was like the only thing that mattered to these people was to push the Germans out, and they gave it their all, and
many lost in the process, but overall they succeeded. Yep.
All right. Well, thank you so much. I think we've gone around the topic very well. Obviously, we're going to recommend the book, The Longest Day, and the movie. They're both really interesting. They're both kind of a little bit tedious and dated, to get through. But really, if you are going to be visiting the area and you're somebody who likes history, I think you would enjoy reading or watching the movie and getting a feel for what it was like. The visuals of the movie are pretty stunning.
And I think that was how this podcast, this episode came about, is that I've seen so many people go over there, and I just know that the more you know about what happened, the more you will get out of your visit there.
Right.
So if that means taking an extra 2 hours some night, 2 weeks ahead, and watching a movie, or a few hours and reading a book, you will truly learn and appreciate it more than if you simply go and, hit the highlights of the Normandy Cemetery, Omaha Beach, and without understanding the context of the overall battle and what happened.
Because today it looks quite peaceful. I mean, there's still remnants but it's a peaceful place.
It is.
People are friendly. It's lovely. It's scenic. There's plenty to see in the area. But the significance of what happened in 1944 is just stunning, and you miss a lot of that if you don't study.
Some have called it the most significant battle of the 20th century, because
it probably was.
I mean, if you think what had happened if we hadn't conquered Germany,
right?
And if you think if D-Day didn't succeed, there's a good chance that we wouldn't have conquered Germany, and we would have sued for peace, and they would have still been in power and maybe still be in power today.
Awesome.
There were other huge battles in World War II, but I can't think of another one battle that changed the course of history as much as that.
Yep. All right, Phil, thank you so much for taking the time to do all this prep work. You can see Phil's notes on all of these and see all these things written out. It's going to be on joinusinfrance.com/199. I think this is one where I will get it transcribed as well. It might not be ready right as soon as I publish the episode, but the transcription will be there because lots of people will want to refer back to that.
Good, good. And enjoy your trip. I know you have one coming up to Paris and to Normandy. And
yes.
Enjoy your trip and give Normandy my regards.
I will do that. I will sprinkle some good thoughts from Phil, and in return, hopefully, it'll come back to you, and you'll go back to Normandy very soon.
I hope so. Great.
Thanks, Phil.
Thank you, Annie.
Au revoir.
Au revoir.
Bonjour, Annie. This is Phil Robertson. I know you just spoke with me a few hours ago, but you need to learn that I'm the type of guy that always thinks of what I should have said. And there's one thing that I really missed out on our talk this afternoon. So one of the most interesting parts of the Battle of Normandy was the need for harbors. And we talked how they didn't land in Pas-de-Calais, which had a large harbor, and the next large harbor was Cherbourg, which is also fortified, and they didn't land there. But they still needed to land men and material in Normandy to keep the resupply of the army marching across the land. So one interesting thing is they developed this thing, and this was actually Winston Churchill's idea, called the Mulberry Harbor. And this was an artificial, prefabricated harbor that they hauled across the English Channel piece by piece. They took old ships and sunk them to create a breakwater, and then they had these huge concrete caissons that were sunk and filled with water and sunk once they got to Normandy, and then had floating bridges that led from them to the shore. And this way they could use Omaha Beach and Gold Beach as artificial harbors where they would dock large ships, dock them right to this artificial harbor, drive off vehicles across these floating pontoons, and bring them all the way to the shore. And it was a real important part of the resupply effort, and there are still at at Gold Beach, remnants of those harbors that are scattered on the beach, and the caissons way out at sea you can still see towards the horizon. At any rate, it's a very interesting story, very interesting part of the Normandy operation. And I don't know if there's any way to add this, or if we had 5 minutes even to talk about it, or you can do your own research and talk about it. But I think it's very interesting, number one, in that it was instrumental in the resupply of the troops, and number two, in that you can still see these remnants out at sea when you visit Gold Beach near Arromanches. And there's even a little museum all about it at Arromanches that has a replica inside, a miniature replica inside the museum. And you can look at that and look out the window and see these huge floating parts of these really floating vehicular roadways that are still strewn out in the sand on the beach. So that's it. Email me or call if you want to talk about it further or add your own comments, but I really think it would add to the story of the Battle of Normandy. Take care. Have a good trip to Paris and to Normandy.
I'm recording this intro really close to the previous one, as a matter of fact, 2 days later. So still no new patrons to thank, but I love you current patrons. To support the show on Patreon, go to patreon.com/join us. Patreon, and join us is without spaces or dashes. And thank you so much, patrons. Look for several rewards coming your way in July, patrons. And speaking of Arromanches-les-Bains, I was just there for the 2018 D-Day celebrations. It was lovely to see all the veterans, the military personnel, the ladies dressed up in period dresses and makeup and hair. It was really lovely, festive. And you can see some of my pictures on joinusinfrance.com/201. But I have to say, if you want to attend the D-Day celebrations in 2019, a lot of the hotels I talked to were saying that they were already fully booked for those dates. So to be in Normandy for D-Day celebrations, this is the sort of thing that you have to plan at least a year in advance and possibly 2 years in advance, which is kind of ridiculous. But Normandy is not a place that has millions of tourists, generally speaking. Well, it does over a long time. And a lot of them want to come, right at the D-Day celebrations. And so they run out of hotel rooms. I would love it if you would share this episode with people you know who are going to be visiting Normandy. Join Us in France is available on your Alexa smart speaker, on your smartphone using Spotify, iTunes, Google Play, or with any number of podcast apps. The one I use right now is called Castro 2. I know there's a Castro 3, but I haven't upgraded to it because it's one of these dreaded subscription models. So I'm not sure I'm ready for that. But there's lots of great options out there to listen to podcasts with. You can even listen on the Join Us in France website, which is the easiest way. And my goal for the summer is to launch the new version of the site because it looks great. It's much better than the old one. The information is organized better, and I've put efforts into the writing, which I normally don't have time to do. But I forced myself, just do a little bit with the English writing. And as you know, English is not my first language. And so sometimes it's a little hard for me to be super creative with writing in English. Anyway, thank you for spreading the word around you about Join Us in France. It really helps, and it will help your friends too. To connect with me, email annie@joinusinfrance.com or leave a message at 1-801-806-1015. You can also ask to join the Join Us in France closed group on Facebook, and when you do, answer the questions or I won't let you in. Have a great week of trip planning, and I'll talk to you next week. Au revoir.
Hi, Annie. It's Steve. I was on your first tour a year ago. Looks like you're on Nesbon right now. Congratulations. Hope it goes well. Wanted to just call and say thank you for the food pricing broadcast. I just listened to it yesterday. Even though I live here now, been here over a year, it was still pretty beneficial. Gave me some tips on things to look at, things I would pass right by. So appreciate it. Appreciate all the effort you put into it. You really spent some time on this one. Anyway, hope your tour goes well, and I'll keep listening.
The Join Us in France travel podcast is written and produced by Annie Sargent and copyright 2018 by Addicted to France. It is released under a Creative Commons Attribution, Non-Commercial, No Derivatives license.